Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kara Bloomberg. I'm Chief Operating Officer of Landrum HR. Like many of you are likely we're working remote, and it's definitely a new stage in our company to have all of our employees remote. So please forgive if you have any random dog barks in the background or kids slamming doors. Just working through this new normal for ourselves, as I'm sure all of you are also. I'd like to take just a few minutes to familiarize you with Landrum HR and our services. We're a national human capital services company, and we're comprised of 4 divisions. Our focus throughout our entire organization is on people. Our Human Resources Outsourcing Division, or PEO, provides HR, health insurance and other benefits, payroll, and workers' compensation to employers of any size. Our Insurance Services Division works hand in hand with our PEO to solve insurance needs for our clients. Workforce Solutions is our division that provides executive recruiting, on-site workforce management, and traditional staffing services. Finally, our HRQ division focuses on national HR search, interim HR staffing, and human capital consulting. As you can tell, we have many ways to simplify your people equation. Our team at Landrum HR has been working hard to compile the information that's coming so quickly out of DC on the new legislation. We appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. Please keep in mind that the situation is evolving quickly every day, and we're continuing to monitor and update as frequently as we can. Today, we're going to focus on the legislation that's already been passed. I imagine we'll be here again next week focusing on the new stimulus package bill that's awaiting approval from the House. Keep an eye on our website, landrumhr.com, for new information, updates, and links to important information. Before we get started, I want to cover a few participation instructions. You can submit questions using the questions pane on your control panel. We will address some questions during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We'll also follow up with our most frequently asked questions from this webinar in a few days for everyone that's registered. In response to all the questions we've been receiving in the last week regarding all the new legislation, we've partnered with Clark Partington to create a white paper. We've made that available for you to download in the handout pane of your control panel. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Jonathan Taylor, Chief Financial Officer of Landrum HR, and Amy Remington, General Counsel for Landrum HR. Jonathan's been with Landrum HR for 15 years. He started his career in accounting with the IRS, or some of you may also know it as the dark side, and spent a number of additional years in finance in the private sector before making his way to Landrum HR. Our General Counsel, Amy Remington, has spent the last 15 years of her career at Landrum HR. Amy has over 20 years in the employment law arena, and she's a national speaker on employment law topics. Amy, why don't you start us off? And Amy, you might be muted.
Thanks, Kara. We are going to talk today about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Next week, we hope to be talking about the Senate bill, the stimulus bill that came from the Senate next week. Let's focus today on the law that actually has passed. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act was passed a week and a day ago. It was passed on March 18th. And we've received guidance as recently as yesterday, March 25th. So this law is continuing to evolve. It's changing on a daily basis. So what I can tell you is what we know today. What we know today is that the law takes effect on April 1st. We initially thought, based on the language of the bill, that it would take effect on April 2nd, but the Department of Labor clarified yesterday that it takes place on April 1st. The other thing that the Department of Labor made very clear in its guidance published yesterday is that any leave taken under this law is not retroactive. So in other words, if somebody were to ask for leave on, say, March 28th, it would not be in effect. The bill doesn't begin until April 1st. And unlike most laws, this law is a temporary law. It lasts from April 1st until December 31st. So it has a definite expiration date. And that's fairly unusual. That doesn't happen frequently. Now, Congress can modify that expiration date if it needs to, but that's the date that's set forth in the law today. There are 4 primary parts to the bill. And we're going to go over each of these parts with a deep dive. But briefly, the four parts are, the first part requires certain employers to provide up to 12 weeks of job-protected leave related to caring for a child. The second part requires certain employers to provide up to 80 hours of emergency sick paid leave to employees for a variety of reasons. The third part that Jonathan will talk about in detail allows employers to apply for certain tax credits to offset the required sick paid leave, the paid family medical leave, and certain health plan expenses. And then the fourth part requires group health plans, health insurers, and government programs to provide free coronavirus testing. And we'll talk about that in detail as well. But for a moment, let's break these down into bite-sized pieces that we can really understand. And we're going to start with the expansion of the Family Medical Leave Act. And to understand the expansion, we first need to understand what the Family Medical Leave Act is, because this portion of the law still exists and has not been changed. So the Family Medical Leave Act is a federal law that provides, as it sounds like, leave for employees if they have certain conditions. So the first thing is the leave applies to covered employers, and those are employers. If you have 50 or more employees who work in a 75-mile radius, you're going to be a covered employer. And then to be an employee, you have to have worked 1,250 hours in the past 12 months. So if those two criteria are met, then you've got a qualifying employee and a covered employer. And the law provides for 12 weeks of unpaid leave for certain conditions. And they're primarily serious health conditions that have to be shown through documentation. So this part of the law is still in play. The expansion does exactly what it sounds like. It expands the Family Medical Leave Act, and it expands who's a covered employer, and it expands who's a qualified employee. So let's look at what the expansion does. The expansion provides that employers who have less than 500 employees must provide up to 12 weeks of job-protected leave related to caring for a child via an expansion of the Family Medical Leave Act. So let's talk first about what 500 employees looks like. There are regulations put out by the FMLA that have been around for a very long time that talk about how you count heads. If you have multiple businesses, for example, you have to look at whether those multiple businesses have common management, whether they have interrelation between operations, whether they have a centralized control of labor relations, and whether there's a common degree of ownership and financial control. So if you're an employer who has many different businesses and you're not sure whether you have to aggregate all of those employees for counting to determine whether you have 500 employees or more, you probably need to work with your CPA, because what you don't want to do is take a position now that's contrary to a position that you've taken in the past with the way that you've counted numbers. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's interesting is the regular FMLA, if you will, applies to employees who have been employed for at least 12 months. But this expansion, you only have to have been employed for 30 days. So that means basically, if you look back at March 2nd, if somebody was employed by you on March 2nd and needed leave beginning April 1st, they would be qualified. And so what would they be qualified for? They would be qualified for leave related to caring for a child. And that's the primary goal of this. If they need leave related to caring for a child, they're entitled to that. So the way the leave is calculated, it's basically a 12-week period, and the first 2 weeks or 10 workdays is unpaid. But if the employee has paid time off, accrued vacation, personal leave, or sick leave, or any kind of mechanism that you've given them to save leave in a bank, for example, they're allowed to use that time to receive pay during that time. So the first 2 weeks are unpaid unless the employee has time in a bank and elects to use it. The next 10 weeks are paid by the employer, but they're not paid at the full rate of pay necessarily. The amount is capped at $200 per day per employee, or $10,000 per employee in the aggregate. And the way you're going to do the math to determine how much money is to be paid is the amount to be paid is not less than 2/3 of an employee's regular rate of pay based on what they normally work. And the regular rate of pay, these are terms used by the Fair Labor Standards Act and other federal laws that govern wage and hour. And what a regular rate of pay is, it's your average rate over the past 6 months prior to the time in which you've taken leave. And if you're in sales, commissions would be counted into that. If you're a tipped employee, your average tip would be counted into that. If you receive piece rate, that math would be done as well. All of that would be incorporated into this calculation. And that is information that came out just yesterday by the Department of Labor. So that's helpful to understand how to calculate that. Now, if you're a part-time employee, the math is a little different. For part-time employees, you would look back at the average number of hours they've worked in the past 2 weeks, unless their hours fluctuate. If their hours fluctuate, then you would look back a longer period of time and look at what the total average of the number of hours worked is to get to that number. And the Department of Labor's website actually has a great informational section to help you do that math to figure out exactly what you have to pay. And the good news is the Department of Labor's website has a wage and hour piece that's part of the Fair Labor Standards Act and an FMLA piece. So the Department of Labor will govern all of these different numbers. Now, if the employee normally works overtime, you do have to account that as well, but you want to make sure you're using the right regular rate to get to what the 2/3 looks like for your employee. So now that you know how to do the math and you know how long the person is entitled to leave for, let's talk about why they can take leave under the expanded FMLA. The leave is available for a qualifying need related to a public health emergency. And a qualifying need related to a public health emergency occurs when an employee is unable to work or telework due to the need for leave because they have to care for a son or daughter who's under 18 if the child's primary or secondary school or their place of care has closed or their child care provider is unavailable because of a public health emergency. So if we break that down a little, a public health emergency is an emergency with respect to COVID-19 because the CDC and the federal government agree that COVID-19 qualifies as a public health emergency under this law. And the other thing is the initial version of this bill said that paid leave was only to be paid if the employee was unable to work. Well, the expanded version of the bill, the technical correction came out to say if the employee could telework. So the language now says, can they work or telework? And this suggests that if an employee can telework while they're caring for a child, that employee might not be eligible for the expanded leave. So you have to look at what the reason the person actually needs the leave. So there are some exceptions to these rules, and the exceptions are largely based on employee size. So for example, if you have fewer than 50 employees, you may, as an employer, seek an exemption if you can show that the requirements will jeopardize the viability of a business as a going concern. What that means is you have to be able to support through financial documents, some kind of objective basis to show that if you use this paid leave, your business will probably close. So that can be very difficult to do, but it is an exemption that's available out there. The second thing is, if you have more than 25 employees, you must reinstate the employee to their original position or to a substantially similar position. And what substantially similar means, it means equal rate of pay, equal rate in status, no substantial change in hours or geographic territory, for example. So the employee is entitled to complete reinstatement, just like they are under the normal FMLA. If somebody takes FMLA under the Normal Act because of their own serious health condition, and they provide you with the right documentation, they are entitled to job reinstatement. And that's the same thing here. Now, what this law provides that the normal FMLA doesn't is if you're a smaller employer with 0 to 24 employees, then you might not have to reinstate the employee. But you have to be able to show through legitimate, objective, non-discriminatory documentation that the employee was on leave due to COVID-19. So it has to be due to COVID-19, that the employee's position no longer exists because of economic conditions, that you have made reasonable efforts to restore the position, restore the employee to their original position, or like I said, a substantially equivalent position, and that you will continue to make reasonable efforts to restore the employee during a 1-year period after the time that the restoration didn't happen. So it's not just a one-time obligation to show that right after or during this period I couldn't restore them and that it was going to harm my business, but instead you have to commit 1 year for a full year that if that position becomes open, that employee will get their job back again. So that's the synopsis of the expanded FMLA. And again, the regular FMLA still applies, but the expanded version has those various nuances where it covers more employers, it covers more employees, and it still has the reinstatement obligations. So let's move on to the Emergency Sick Paid Leave Act, which if you're watching any news show, they'll call IPSLA. It's a new, of course, it's only 7 days old, so we're still learning about it. But it provides, remember I talked about 12 weeks of leave, the first 2 weeks were unpaid and the next 10 were paid? Well, yesterday, the Department of Labor made clear that this portion of the law provides for an initial 2 weeks of paid leave. So, in the Department of Labor's words and their guidance were, this period thus covers the first 10 working days of expanded FMLA, which are otherwise unpaid under the Expansion Act, unless the employee elects to use sick, vacation, or personal leave under the employer's policy. So they made it clear yesterday that we're not talking about 14 weeks of leave. So they don't get 2 weeks of paid sick leave under IPSLA and then another 12 weeks under the expanded. Instead, they would get the first 2 weeks as being part of the emergency paid leave, and then the next 10 weeks being done with the 2/3 math that we talked about. So in summary, it requires the employers with fewer than 500 employees, like we just talked about, you count heads the same way, to provide up to 80 hours of emergency sick paid leave. And I must mention that there are exceptions to this rule, and one exception is for healthcare providers and emergency responders. So if you are in a business where you're a healthcare provider and an emergency responder, the rules for you might be a little different. This is such a fluid area that we are continuing to watch this to see how these will change and if we'll get some more guidance on healthcare providers and emergency responders. And I do believe that yesterday the Department of Labor put something out about that, and we're going to look at that more closely to see what that means. But for the people who are non-emergency responders, one thing that's important to note is that unlike the regular FMLA, in this case, all employers qualify. So what they've said is that if you're engaged in interstate commerce and you have fewer than 500 employees, you have to do this. And the standard for determining whether you're engaged in interstate commerce is set so that almost every employer is. It means, do you do any business with any other state? Do you use the U.S. Postal Service? Do you use a wireless service that crosses state lines? Do you have any banking or credit union relationships that go across state lines? And if the answer to any of those is yes, then you're going to be a covered employer here. And then the other thing that's a little different about this 80-hour portion, this first 2-week portion, is that all employees qualify, regardless of the length of time of employment. So remember, under the regular FMLA, you have to be employed for 12 months. Under the expanded version, for the small piece of it, it's 30 days. But for this paid sick leave, regardless of the length of employment, you have to, all employees qualify. So let's look at who can use it and under what circumstances. So the way we determine who the circumstances is broken down kind of in two piles. The first 3 prongs relate to the employee's own situation. The last 2 prongs relate to somebody else. So The paid sick leave is available to any employee who is subject to a state, federal, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19. So again, it still has to be related to COVID-19. Second, the employee has been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19, or the employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking a medical diagnosis. Now, before you, as an employer, decline somebody's request for leave based on number 3 and require that they provide you with some kind of documentation that they're seeking a medical diagnosis, I would advise all employers to recognize that it might be difficult for people to get a medical diagnosis for several reasons. One, many primary practitioners are swamped and can't get people in. Secondly, the tests are so difficult to get. We've got a lot of people who are seeking tests and have not gotten them yet. And the third reason is because we are not doctors making medical decisions, so we can't say whether somebody is appropriately seeking medical diagnosis. Instead, I would leave that up to the employee and their physician. I would not substitute our own judgment for that of a physician. If an employee tells you that they're seeking a medical diagnosis, my best advice is to give them the benefit of the doubt. So then the second piece of this is for an employee who is caring for a person who meets number 1 or 2. So if I'm your employee and I am taking care of somebody who is subject to a quarantine or isolation order, I would qualify. Or if I were an employee who was taking care of somebody who has to self-quarantine, then I would qualify as well. But the bigger and more likely area where you're going to see employees requesting time off for leave is where the employee is caring for a son or daughter where their school has been closed and the child care is unavailable. That's where most of your employees will likely fall, because they will be, I know at least where I am in Florida, all of our public schools are closed, all of our private schools are closed, all of our universities are closed, and so all of the children in the state of Florida are out of school and they're schooling at home. And so if you have a child who has to care for a son or daughter because their child care is unavailable, their school is closed due to COVID-19, they're going to qualify for this 80 hours of sick leave. So let's talk about specifically how many hours each employee gets, because not everybody gets 80, and how we calculate it. So we have to look at whether they're part or full-time. If somebody is a full-time employee, they get 80 hours of leave. And it doesn't matter how you count the 80 hours. So for example, if you count 30 hours a week as being full-time, then that's the number that you would regularly use. If you are an employer and you say, well, gosh, my health carrier group health plan says I have to have full-time defined as 32 hours, then that's okay. But if you say, well, I have my people work 7.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, so I consider full-time to be 35 hours, that's okay. Or if you say, I'm a traditional employer and 40 hours is a full-time job, that's okay too. However you define full-time is what you need to stick with. But in any event, they're going to get 10 days of pay. Now, for part-time employees, as I mentioned earlier, you calculate their leave based on the average number of hours they work in a 2-week period. And if the hours are unknown, then you can use a 6-month average to calculate the average daily hours. And part-time employees are paid for this leave based on that number of hours. So it's kind of a pro rata math, which makes sense. Now, the other thing I would remind you is that if an employee normally works overtime, those hours are included, but still subject to the caps. And so what are the caps and how much are people paid? Well, how much somebody is paid depends again on the reason that they're unable to work. So if the leave is for the employee themselves, the employee's regular rate of pay is used, that 100% of the regular rate of pay is used, and payment is capped at $511 a day or $51.10 in the aggregate for that 10-week period. If the leave is to care for a child or a family member, the sick leave pay is based on 2/3 of that regular rate, and it's capped, again, at $200 a day or $2,000 in the aggregate per employee. Now, like most federal laws, there is a no retaliation provision. And so what that means is, just like Title VII or any of your federal laws that provide protection to employees, it means you cannot discharge somebody for exercising their right under this federal law. You can't discipline somebody for exercising their rights under this law. And you have to reinstate them, as we said, unless you fall into that very narrow exception that we discussed earlier. And you can't retaliate in any way, shape, or form, and you certainly cannot discharge somebody. If you discharge somebody, you'll be in violation of the law, and that's not a great place to be. The Congress has really put some teeth into this law because they made violations of this law punishable under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the reason that is relevant is because the Fair Labor Standards Act it might be the only federal law that has individual liability. And what that means is, if I'm an employer and my company gets sued for violation of Title VII, then my company is the one that's sued, but I, as an owner of the company and a decision maker, can't be sued individually. But under the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's not the way it works. If I violate this law, then I can be sued individually as well as my company being sued. And so insurance policies treat this differently, but it's a very risky position to be in. But Congress clearly intended to put some teeth into making sure employers were highly motivated to comply with this law. Now, just as of yesterday as well, there was a new notice requirement. And this notice is similar to all the other notices you probably have posted all over your break rooms. So, for example, you probably have your current FMLA poster up and your wage and hour and your workers' compensation poster up. This is similar to that. It provides notice to the employees of their rights under this law. It's available free at dol.gov. You can download it. You have to provide it. Again, it applies to all employers with less than 500 employees. So let's start there. And then you have to post it on your premises. You have to provide it to each and every employee if they work remote. So if you have employees who work remote, I would highly suggest putting it on your intranet if you have one of those, putting it in an email to every employee, if you can do a mass email to all of your employees. If you have to, you can even put it in the mail with a stamp and do it the old-fashioned way. But that's probably not the most efficient. It's probably much more efficient to put it on your intranet and to do the physical posting. So that's a requirement that's an immediate requirement. It's not available in other languages yet, but the Department of Labor says it will first be available in Spanish, and then they will translate it into other languages. So if you do need other languages, they'll provide that to you as quickly as possible. So the next provision that we're going to talk about are the tax credits that are required for paid sick leave, paid family and medical leave, and certain health plan expenses. And Jonathan, our CFO, is going to take over that portion.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. I am going to talk about some good news in this new law, and that is the availability of tax credits related to the payment of sick leave, the expanded FMLA, and certain health plan expenses. And so the goal of the credit is to fully reimburse employers for wages required to be paid under the new law, and that is the paid sick leave and the paid FMLA requirements that Amy has been talking about. The credit is increased by the amount of employers' qualified health plan expenses that are properly allocable to the qualified sick leave wages for which such credit is allowed. So that means that if the employer is also paying some of the health premiums on a group health plan for those employees, there can be an allocation of some of that health premium in addition to the wages that is allowed for the credit. Another positive out of this is that the payments are not subject to FICA taxes for the employer, but the credit is claimed through payroll taxes and is reported on the Form 941. So eligible employers who pay qualifying sick or child care leave will be able to retain an amount of the payroll taxes equal to the amount of the qualifying sick and child care leave they paid, rather than depositing with them with the IRS. And the government has promised further guidance on this process. So to summarize that is you'll pay these required wages that Amy has been talking about. And to get a reimbursement for that from the government, you would reduce your taxes that you would normally deposit for payroll taxes for all of your employees. Now, if there's not enough taxes to cover the cost of the qualified sick and child care leave paid, employers will be able to file a request for an accelerated payment from the IRS. And the IRS expects to process these requests within 2 weeks or less. They have also promised further detailed guidance on that process. Landrum HR is paying the taxes, the payroll taxes, and reporting them on the Form 941 for their clients. We will be issuing guidance on the process to report the wages and claim the credits. We are working internally and with our technology partners to develop the process, and we'll be communicating that out to our clients soon of how that process will work with us. The other thing of note in this is that there is no double benefit. And what that means is that the payments that are claimed as a credit cannot also be used as a deduction. So if you pay the wages, claim a credit, and get a full reimbursement for those, you cannot claim them as a credit. As a deduction also. You just get the credit only. I also understand that the state of Florida right now has a bridge loan program. We've had a couple of clients. We've been talking to them about their application, and we are helping them with the payroll, with the employees' wages, as since we're the ones paying those and gathering that data to support the application. And as other loan programs come out that require data related to employee wages, we will be glad to help our clients with those things. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to move into coronavirus testing and group health plans. Because the fourth part of the bill requires group health plans, health insurers, and government programs to provide free coronavirus testing. Now, this testing does not necessarily mean diagnostics or treatment. So that's a little different, but it does provide for free coronavirus testing, and it has no cost sharing. That means there are no deductibles, there are no copays, and there is no co-insurance. The other thing is there is no prior authorization requirement related to COVID-19 testing. So group health plans and health insurance carriers must cover FDA-approved COVID-19 testing to include both the items and the services furnished during that provider visit. This starts from the date of the enactment, which is the 1st of April, until the Secretary of Human Services determines that the public health emergency of COVID-19 has expired. So the testing could go on past the life of this bill, or it may end a little earlier. The Secretary of Health and Human Services is the one who makes that decision. But I think it is good news for all of us, because if anybody has any concern about their financial obligation and doesn't want to get tested because they're afraid of the bill they might get, then they need to know that this is actually free, and the government wants to encourage people who need tests to be able to get those tests. Now, some other considerations, and this covers a lot of different laws, and I won't get into the weeds on all of these, but I'm going to give you at a high level some things to kind of think about and some red flags to watch out for. So HIPAA is the first law, and all the employers are probably aware that this rule permits covered entities and business associates. It requires that they keep confidential all protected health information. But there is an exception to the rule as necessary to help public health authorities safely carry out their duties. So that means that covered entities can make reports to public health agencies. But otherwise, all of the privacy laws that are in state and federal law still have to be respected. And so what that essentially means is that if you're an employer and you've got some employees asking about another employee's health, just like you would do on any medical situation, you should not be disclosing or sharing that person's COVID-19 status or any of their health status at all. As I said, the Family Medical Leave Act is still completely enforced the way it always has been. So if leave doesn't qualify under the expanded leave or under the paid sick leave, it might still qualify for that unpaid but job protected leave by the regular FMLA. So there was a change to the Americans with Disabilities Act. The general rule is that medical examinations, like taking somebody's temperature, for example, that those medical examinations are prohibited unless they can be proven that they're job related and consistent with business necessity. So the way the EEOC, who oversees all of this, looks at this is they say, well, medical exams are allowed if the employee's actual or suspected medical condition may impair their ability to perform the essential functions of their job, or the employer has a reasonable belief that the employee poses a direct threat to his own safety or that of others, and that threat cannot be eliminated through reasonable accommodations. So you have to have objective evidence to support this. But as of March 19th, about midweek, according to the CDC, COVID-19 is a direct threat as defined under the law. Therefore, the EEOC has now said that employers may ask employees who report to work feeling ill or who call in sick, they may ask questions about their symptoms to determine if they have or may have COVID-19, and they may measure body temperatures. But again, I would caution you, unless you're a medical practitioner, the better practice would still be to refer somebody to their physician to make that diagnosis. It should not be a diagnosis that a non-health professional attempts to make. And then, as I said earlier, the anti-discrimination and anti-retaliation and privacy provisions all apply. With respect to the EEOC, an employer can ask for a medical certification of fitness for duty before they allow an employee who's been ill to return to work. But the pragmatic part of that is that doctors are overwhelmed, and it may be very, very difficult for an employee to get that medical certification. So before an employer holds somebody back from returning to work, if the employee says they aren't able to get the return to work form completed, that may be a completely true statement. You need to be very careful about denying somebody return to work. And then, of course, state workers' compensation laws and state privacy laws and state-specific COVID-19 laws and local municipal rules and regulations have to be followed because there are so many of those coming out, and we want to make sure that our employers aren't running afoul of any local, state, or federal law inadvertently when they mean to do the right thing. Now, OSHA is one of the questions we've gotten is about, what about OSHA? What does OSHA say about COVID-19? Because, of course, OSHA contains a general duty clause in the Act that says that an employer shall furnish to employees an employment place that is free from hazards and recognized harm. And so OSHA has actually issued a guidance on preparing the workforce for COVID-19. And they've also said that a covered employer, if you are an OSHA covered employer, should record any COVID-19 related illnesses in your OSHA 300 log if an employee has a confirmed case, it's work related, and it involves one or more of the criteria in the OSHA regs. So if you are an OSHA covered employer and you have an OSHA 300 log, you probably need to dig into that a little bit further. But the other thing that's not really related to employment, but I think is relevant to all employees, is that our normal April 15th tax deadline to file and pay our taxes has been extended until July 15th. So Landrum HR has put together a list of resources that are really great resources, and these are all resources that are changing and they're fluid. They're constantly being updated as the law is being updated. The CDC website is a great place to start. The OSHA guidance that I mentioned is found at osha.gov. And the EEOC website has a specific guidance on pandemic preparedness. It was actually created in 2009 in relation to the influenza epidemic, but then they have updated it as recently as last week to address COVID-19. So it's a great guidance as well. And then, as Kara mentioned in the very beginning, we have partnered with Clark Partington and posted a white paper that was updated just yesterday on all things related to COVID-19. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kara.
Thanks, Amy. And we're getting a lot of great questions. And just a reminder for everybody about the handout. Amy, you just mentioned that it's downloadable here. Worked with Clark Partington Law Firm on that response. That covers a lot of what we've already discussed here in the webinar. You'll also receive a link to the webinar. And I know we may not be able to get to all of your questions today, so we'll also work on a list of the most frequently asked questions that we can get back out to you if we don't get to your questions answered today. I want to take just a minute before we jump into the questions and ask all of you if you would mind answering a question for us. You know, everything's been happening so quickly. It feels like we were talking about COVID-19 for a long time, reading about it in other parts of the world. And now all of a sudden it feels just like a huge wave upon us. And I know for our company, you know, have employees that, you know, obviously we're concerned about everyone's well-being, also thinking about, you know, our own business, and just want to get a sense for all of you that are attending today, if you feel like your business currently right now is being financially impacted by COVID-19. So a couple of options there on the screen. Yes, significantly financially impacted right now. Yes, somewhat impacted. Not sure yet, or no, not yet. Just wanted to see, we're collecting the responses now. Going to give just a couple more seconds here, and we'll share with you the results. Kind of all over the board right now. Definitely most responses leaning towards yes, significantly already. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out here. So what we saw is about 41% of you that responded said yes, significantly. That's not surprising. There are a few industries and organizations that haven't been affected. As time goes on, it's really essential to stay on top of all the evolving legislation, and hopefully it will minimize the impact and be prepared to hit the ground running when things start getting turned around. We had 30% answer yes, somewhat, 19 not sure yet, and 10 that no, not yet, and that's great too, great to hear. So Amy and Jonathan, if you're ready, we're going to jump into some questions.
Absolutely.
Let me get those questions up on the screen here for me. So Amy, this first one is for you. It has to do specifically with an employee that has been tested for COVID-19 and is awaiting test results and is in quarantine. That employee would like to work from home, and the employer is asking, should we allow him to work from home, or what are the legal implications of letting him work from home?
That's a great question, because as Kara mentioned, I know that our whole office is working from home. I know many offices have closed entirely, and it's been really amazing to watch how people have evolved so quickly into learning to work from home and to use the resources, the technology that's available today. So I think that if somebody can work from home, it is beneficial to let them work from home, as long as there are a couple parameters that are respected. And the first, of course, would be an IT parameter. Do you have the technology, whether you're talking about firewalls or logons or passwords, do you have the technology to protect your information? Because if you have social security numbers, if you have individual phone numbers, if you have bank account numbers, that is not information that your employee may have access to it for legitimate business reasons, but that employee's roommate or spouse or family should not have access to that. And the same kind of goes for a workspace. If the employee doesn't have a workspace that can be a little more private, that could be problematic because you may inadvertently be sharing private information that shouldn't be shared. And then, of course, there's the safety aspect. You want to make sure that the individual's workspace is a safe space, and it's not going to be full of cords and things that might make somebody fall. I think if I had to guess, I would say that trip and falls are probably the most common thing about home workspaces, remote workspaces, because they're sometimes not set up as offices. They're set up in dining rooms and living rooms so that there's a lot of cords going everywhere, and so it does give an opportunity for trip and falls. But I think when you write all of this out in a telework policy, it makes it very clear to people why they have to have those IT protections in place, what kind of extra vigilance they have to have with the data they have and the security that they have, and that they are expected to actually work. I mean, there are some employees who will work twice as productively in the quiet of their own home, and there are some employees who might not. So I think it requires an extra level of supervisor engagement to keep employees on task, to make sure they're doing meaningful work, and to make sure they're actually being productive while they're at work, so that when you pay them in accordance with the Fair Labor Standards Act, you will be paying the right wages for the right amount of time that was worked.
Thanks, Amy, for that. We're getting a lot of questions. We have attendees from all over the country, and we've gotten a number of very specific city and state questions based on where our attendees are located. So I know it'll be hard to deep dive into that here, but Amy, do you have suggestions, or Jonathan, on where people can go for more state and city-specific guidance? Of course, these are federal laws, legislation that we've been discussing here, but anything that may be a nuance that they want to focus on within their own state.
Sure. I know I just had this question with respect to Florida and unemployment. So, just narrow down to one state and narrow down to one topic, one state. So I went online and I saw what resources were available. And it turns out the Florida unemployment or reemployment website is a great source. It has access to filing a claim. It has frequently asked questions like, how much will I receive, and how is it calculated, and when will I start to receive it, and what are the circumstances that I might receive it, what documentation do I have to provide. So the states have done, I think, a very good job of providing that information. So I would look at what state the person's asking about, and then within that, what their Department of Labor is saying, or what their Fair Employment Board, whatever that's called in that state, is saying. That's where I would probably start for specific information.
And I would add just to that, that's great, Amy, but I would add, and then maybe Department of Revenue for the specific states also may have information on any type of credits or anything that they're offering for that state.
Amy and Jonathan, similar to our client webinar that we held earlier this week, there's a lot of questions around PTO and how it applies with the leave policies. So I'll throw you a specific one here, and maybe you can expand. But specifically, are employees supposed to use their regular leave time before utilizing any of these leaves? Say they have a week of sick leave banked, would they need to utilize that before applying for sick leave?
Well, so the sick leave provision is the first 2 weeks we talked about, not the last 10 weeks. And the law does say that the employee is allowed to use that time to be made whole, so they can use it. because don't forget the first 2 weeks is unpaid. But if they have sick leave, the employee can say, well, gosh, I'd prefer to save my sick leave, or the employee can say, well, I'd prefer to be made whole and get paid for that 2 weeks. So they can use it. Now, if they only have a week, then they could use that week and take the second week as unpaid, because those first 2 weeks are unpaid.
Okay, so clarifying, any leave or PTO that employee has through their employer, they can use during that first 2 weeks during the unpaid portion of the sick leave time.
And it's the employee's option, not the employer's option.
Okay. Oh, that's a good clarification there. So some additional questions around the April 1st date. So if employees are already claiming a leave for specific situations, how does this legislation affect employees that are already on leave? What are we hearing about anything being retroactive?
Well, the Department of Labor's guidance that came out yesterday specifically answered this question and said this law begins on April 1st. It does not apply to leave taken prior to April 1st.
Yeah, pretty cut and dry there on that. So April 1st effective date for all of these things. Question, yes, Amy, on the posting requirements. On the posting requirements that you mentioned, do you have a suggestion on where someone can access the posting requirement information, or what the name of the form would be?
Oh, that's a great question. It is available for free on the Department of Labor's website. So if somebody goes to dol.gov and there's a search bar at the upper right corner and type in expanded leave notice, that document will pop up, and it is literally a printout version, printed out in color, and you can just post that. They didn't make it hard at all. You don't have to order it from a third-party company or pay for it in any way, shape, or form. It is a print and post. They've made it as easy as possible. Now, as I said, if you've got people working remote, you want to email it to them, you want to put it on your intranet, you want to disseminate it as well as you can to all of your various employees, but they've made it pretty darn easy to do that.
All right, we have an employer on that must be taking temperatures of their employees and wants to know, what if someone refuses to have their temperature taken?
Oh gosh, it's a hard question. I would have to look at the EEOC guidance on that. My recollection is that the current guidance on pandemic awareness, the one that was just posted last week, says that an employer can require it if there's a direct threat, and that they have said COVID-19 is a direct threat. So my recollection is that employers can require it, but I would definitely want to double check that before I reprimanded somebody or let somebody go for not participating.
Amy, getting some questions around the exemptions that we've been told for employers that are less than 50 employees. Just wanting to know a little bit more about how they can access information on the exemption policies. How they can apply for the exemptions. I'm going to be honest with you, there's not a lot of guidance out there yet. I anticipate that in the next coming week or so, we'll get a lot more information, just like the Department of Labor has been working overtime to try to get those frequently asked questions out. I don't know at this point how somebody applies for the exemption, but if I had a crystal ball, I would guess that the Department of Labor will probably put up something on their website that says, here's how you apply. And in fact, you can probably apply online through the Department of Labor's website, but I don't know the answer to that now, and I'm not sure that there is an answer to that right now. You know, I think the only thing that we saw come out from the Department of Labor yesterday was, please don't send us your exemption information today. So I think they're just letting people go on notice that there will be some way to file an exemption, but they don't yet want that information coming through the DOL.
Right. I don't think there's a mechanism for them to review it or to hold it yet. So I bet that by April 1st, there will be a mechanism, but right now I don't think there is one.
So, Amy, you had mentioned some information about the doctor's notes and with sick employees and returning to work, and we've got a number of questions there. So could you clarify, is the employer allowed to ask for employees who have been quarantined to provide a doctor's note before coming back to work?
So yes, that is also in the most recent EEOC guidance that came out. It's an exception to the general rule by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says that you can't ask for that personal medical information. But what the EEOC said was employers may ask employees who report feeling ill at work or who call in sick questions about their symptoms to determine if they have or they may have COVID-19, and they may measure body temperatures. And then it goes on to say that an employer may also require a medical certification, which is called a fitness for duty, before an employee returns to work. So if there's a serious concern that somebody has been very ill and you would like to quarantine them or keep them away from work a little longer, you can require that they provide that fitness for duty medical certification. But I think you have to balance that with the acknowledgement that it may be difficult for employees to get that, so it may delay their return to work even longer.
Question, Amy, around the full-time employees and EPSLA, the extended paid sick leave. If they work more than 40 hours a week, can they get more than 80 hours on the EPSLA provisions, paid sick leave?
Great question. That is actually one of the questions that came out of the guidance that came out yesterday. And per the guidance as of yesterday, 80 hours is a total maximum amount. The employee can only take up to 2 weeks or 10 work days of paid sick leave for any combination of the qualifying reasons. So no, there is no 81 hours or anything bigger than that. It's 80 hours is the maximum.
Great. And then, Amy, and I know we've been waiting for a lot more additional guidance on this, but I will bring it up because a lot of people are asking around if they are in an area of the country that's been quarantined, or they work in an industry that's been asked to not come to work. How do those provisions work with the Sick Leave Act? And is the entire employer and all of the employees going to qualify under the Sick Leave Act for pay?
So I was actually on a call this morning with industry colleagues from all around the country, and that was a question that nobody had a great answer to. I mean, clearly the law starts on April 1st, so anybody who was taken off work prior to that would not qualify. But I think the answer depends on whether they're still employed and what the reason for being off work is. I mean, so I just don't have an answer for that, and I'm not sure anybody does at this point. That is something that I hope we certainly have an answer to before April 1st, because that is a critical question that affects so many people throughout the United States. That's a great question.
Yeah, I'm hoping by next week, as the new legislation comes out and the DOL has more time to sort through probably the mounds of questions that they're receiving on this legislation, that we'll get clarification and be able to get that updated on our website and in our next webinar. So we're about a minute away. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Amy.
Oh, I was just going to say, Jonathan and I have talked about this ad nauseum, but legislation normally takes years to write and to create and flesh out the details. And this is over 100 pages of legislation that was created in a bipartisan way in less than 5 days. So that's a wonderful thing, but it does leave a lot of questions asked. And the Senate's been so busy with their 800-page stimulus bill that there are still a lot of questions. It's an evolving area. And at Landrum HR, we're committed to staying on top of this. And we just need to be fluid and realize that not all questions are going to be answered right now.
Yeah, I think there'll be quite a few of us reading 800 pages of the stimulus bill over the weekend for our fun reading. I want to thank everybody so much. Amy and Jonathan, thanks for your expert knowledge. I know this is a hard time. It's a difficult time for everyone across the country. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions. We just had a ton of questions flooding in. But again, we'll be, please be looking at our website. We'll be sending this recording out. The white paper does address a lot of information, and that's listed on your handout that you can print. And then we'll work towards some more frequently asked questions based on what we saw today on the webinar. So thank you so much for attending. And on behalf of Landrum HR and our presenters, stay safe. And we hope that you'll join us again in our next webinar. Thanks.